Hi everyone, and you are welcome to this lecture, Introduction to Functions. In our previous lectures, we have used functions a lot, but in this lecture, we are going to learn how we can build our own functions. So I will start by defining what a function is, then we will see why functions are important. After that, we will learn how to define and call functions, how to document a function, and we will understand the difference between parameters and arguments, and I will end up this lecture by a quick summary. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to start by defining what a function is. Function is a block of code that performs a specific task. This task could be calculating a mathematical expression, or for example, printing some results in a specific format, or anything else your program needs. You have to know that when you want to define a function, you have to write some codes. And when you define your function, the codes will not be executed until you call your function. So keep in mind that when you write your function code, you just define a function, but the code is gonna to be executed when you call that function. The function can accept some data inputs, which are known as parameters, and the function will take these inputs in order to process them in some way, and then will give you the result. The result could be printed, or the function could return the actual data, so you can use this data somewhere else in your program. As you note here, I use the word can when I say some data inputs, and the word can when I say returns some results, because it's optional to pass data inputs or to make the function return values. Now let's see the function syntax. In order to define a function, you have to use the keyword def, then you have to give your function a name, you will open a parenthesis, you will give the parameters that your function needs, and then you will put colon. After that, you will write statement or multiple statements, and finally, the function will end by return statement, which will return one result or multiple results values. You can see here that I put colon here, and please do not forget this colon, otherwise you will get a syntax error. Also here we have some indentation at the beginning, and this indentation will make the interpreter understand that this block of code belongs to this function. And you have to know that return statement is optional inside the function, so you can define a function that does not return anything. For the function name, you have to use the same rules that we have defined before about identifier names. So what you use to define a variable name or a module name, you can use to define a function name. When the interpreter runs this part of code, will understand now that there is a function, its name function name. But the code within the function will be executed when you call the function. So if you want to call a function, you have to say function name, so you will use the name of the function. You have to pass the arguments that the function needs, and then the function will work and return some results. These results will be assigned into variables like result1, result2 until result n. You have to know that you have to put variables here to accept the values only if your function here has this return statement. So to call a function, just use function name, pass the argument, and get the result. As you see, when I define a function, I use the word parameter, but when I call a function, I use the word argument. So what is the difference between parameters and argument? So parameter is a variable listed inside the parentheses in the function definition. So when you say def function name and you put here some names, these names known as parameters. Whereas argument is the parameter value that is passed to the function when it's called. So when you call a function, we say argument 1, argument 2, argument n. For example, assume your function take a string, its name parameter 1. So parameter 1 or par1 call the parameter. When you call your function, you will say, for example, the value of this string equal to John. John in this case will be the function argument. Now let's move to PyCharm IDE in order to see some examples about functions. First of all, let's see why functions are important. Let me assume that I want to print hello world 4 times, like here. Hello world 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I decided to print these statements again in another place in my project. So I just copy and paste. And again, I want to use it in another place. So I copy and paste and so on. Assume I have done this step 100 times. Now after that, I noted that I have a mistake. Instead of printing 1, 2, 3, 4, I should have printed 4, 3, 2, 1. Because of that, I have to go to all the locations inside my program and update this part of code to fix the bug that I have found. But if you use function, you can define your code that you want to use multiple times in one location, and then if any problem happens, you can come to this location and update your code once, and it is going to be updated everywhere you use this function inside your project. So maintainability and reusability are great features that you have to know about functions. Now let's see how we can define a function and call that function. First of all, you have to use the keyword diff. Assume I want to define a function that print the following statement, hi man for example. So I will say diff say hi, parenthesis, colon, and then print hi man. Now if I run this code, nothing will be printed as you see here, because until now I'm just defining the function. But if I want to use that function, I have to call. And in order to call, you have to use the function name, and within the parentheses you have to pass the arguments. But now my function does not accept any parameter, so in this case no need to pass anything here. Let me run. As you see now I got hi man, so the function is executed when I call it here. Now let's upgrade our function and make this function accept a parameter, which is the name that we want to say hi for. So for example, if I say here name, and I want to use this name to say hi for this man. And for this purpose, I'm going to use a formatted string. Now as you note here, directly there is a yellow box and say parameter name and field. So you have to pass the name. Now if I say Samir, for example, and I run, I will find hi Samir. So now my function take a parameter name, and when I use this function, I give this parameter the value Samir. Samir in this case is an argument, name is a parameter. The function can take any number of arguments you want to pass. So for example, let's say I want to pass the title with the name. So I want to say hi, for example, Mr. Samir or Dr. Samir or engineer, etc. according to the title. So I will say title here, and now my function takes two parameters, and here I have to pass a value. So let's say, for example, engineer dot. Now if I run my code, you will find that hi engineer Samir. So my function accepts two arguments values in this case. You can note here that when I call my function, the value eng or eng has been assigned to title, and the value of Samir has been assigned to the name. So the order here is exactly like the order here. If you want to use a different order, you have to use the name with the variable. So for example, if I want to pass the name before engineer, in this case you have to say name equal to Samir, and then you have to say title equal to engineer dot. If I run, as you see here, I got exactly the same result. And I am able to do that because now I am using a keyword arguments in which I'm specifying the name of the parameter that I want to assign the argument value to. And in this way, I'm able to use the parameter order that I want. Now let's talk about another idea, which is default values. In some contexts, your function could have some parameters with default values, which mean when you pass this value, the parameter will take the value that you pass, otherwise the parameter will take the default value. So for example here, assume I want to say hi man, for example, but if you specify the name, the word man will be replaced. So let me remove title from here, and I will make my function again accept only one parameter, and here I will remove this part, and I will give a default value to name, which is man. Now my function accepts one parameter, which is name, and this name now is optional. So if you pass a name, it will be assigned to the variable name. Otherwise, the default value man will be assigned to the variable or parameter name. Now let's see the result. If I don't pass anything here and run, I will get hi man. But if I say here now Samir and run, I will get hi Samir. And this happened because I'm using a default value here. Until now, we see how we can define a function, we see how we can pass parameters, and we see how we can assign a default value to the parameters. Now let's see an example to understand how we can make a function return a value. Assume I want to define a function that calculates the age by year. So I can say calculate age, and this function will take the birth year and the current year. This function will calculate my age. So how to calculate the age? It's very simple. It's current year minus birth year, and I will return the age. Run. Nothing happened because this is just a function definition. Let's call now, and now I will say a equal to calculate age, and I will say birth year, for example 1900, and let's say current year 1910, and then I will print a and run. As you see here, this function returns a value which is integer, and it's the difference between these two variables. I used return statement to make my function return a values. Now if I remove this return statement and run, as you see I will get none. So a function without return statement will give me none value. Also, keep in your mind that your function could return more than one value. So let me calculate, for example, my age per day, which is equal to my age per year, multiply by 365, which is number of days per year. And now I will make my function returns two values, and you note here that I'm using a comma to separate between the values that I want to return. Now, if I run this code, as you see here, I will get a as a tuple of values. So I got two values, which is 10, number of years, 3650, which is number of days. Also, you can use more than one variable, and in this case, the function will unpack all the values over all the variables. So if I run here, you will note now that a is 10 and b is 3650, and there is no tuple anymore. If I try to put C here and run, I will get value error. Why value error? Because here I'm using three variables, whereas my function returned only two values. So there is no enough values to be unpacked over variables. So when you see an error like this, just remind that the function that you use returns less or more values than the variables that you use here. And if you use only one variable, you will receive the result as a tuple of values. The last idea that I want to mention in this code session is how we can document our function. And documentation is very important in your projects because it will make you remember later on, and it will make your colleague understand what your function does. In order to write a documentation strings, you have to use triple quotes at the beginning of the function, and then you have to say what your function does. So for example, I will say this function calculates my age. Now, why I choose to use triple quote here? Let me show you this. If I use now help function and I pass my function, which is calculate age, and run, you will get here a string printed, show you the following: your function name, the parameters that your function takes, and the documentation string. So what I put here inside triple quote below my function name will appear here in the output of the help function. So keep in mind, we document functions by using triple quotes. And that's all for this code session. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this lecture. First of all, function has been defined as a block of code that performs a specific task. Functions are very important because of reusability and maintainability. In order to define a function, we use def keyword. A parameter is listed in the parentheses in the function definition, whereas an argument is the parameter value. In order to call a function, you have to use the function name, and if you want to make your function return some values, you have to use return keyword. Also, in Python, we saw that it's possible to assign default values to functions parameters, and it's very important to know that parameters with default values must come after parameters without default values in the function definition. So if you want to define a function with two parameters, the first one doesn't take any default value, the second one take a default value, so you have to put the first argument on the left and the second argument on the right, and that's all. Now please refer to the file Introduction to Functions Challenges, in which you will find some exercises to practice what you have learned in this lecture. Thank you very much for your time, and if you are available, join me in the next lecture.